Hi, friends. Just a warning that this episode talks about war and has graphic descriptions of violence. Please take care whilst listening to this episode.
It's 2001. Kylie's Can't Get You Out of My Head is hot on the radio waves. iTunes has just launched, and it's the year of Anthrax, 9/11, and the start of the US's War on Terror.
It is also the 18th year of the Sri Lankan Civil War.
Between the Tamil and Sinhalese people, there were a lot of language problems, discrimination. A lot of Tamil people were killed. They were put in tires and burnt alive. Their lives were taken in front of our eyes. Our land was occupied. Even though I was young, I had no choice but to witness this. I knew that these things happened.
There is no shortage of stories of the Sri Lankan Civil War, especially from Tamil people in the north and east. And for people like Priya and Nades, this is what they've known for most of their lives.
There were people in military trucks shooting out from both sides.
There was a pukara
A ground attack aircraft.
that dropped a bomb on us. I was wounded.
But 2001 is also the year where a ceasefire commences.
And that was maybe the only time in the entire history since 1948 where there was actually the possibility for a just resolution.
But not everyone cares about peace. Other countries have their own agenda in this war. So what happens if peace isn't reached?
And how does this affect Priya and Nades? What actually causes them to leave for Australia?
You're about to find out.
You have been told a lie.
To stop the deportation of a Tamil family.
Let them in! Let them stay!
Protecting Australia's borders. Hypocrisy. Detained on Christmas Island.
The United Nations Convention on Refugees. This is our country.
We are a generous, open-hearted people.
A lie.
I'm Tanesh the Lenada Raja.
I'm Jay Ui.
This is episode 2, Bloody Pearl.
Tanesh, I have to admit, before starting work on this series, I didn't even know Sri Lanka had a civil war.
Which is like crazy to me considering one of your best friends is Tamil and the war literally went on for over 25 years.
I'm sorry, it just must not have been reported much in the Australian news. That, or I don't really follow the news.
Or you don't really care about me, let's be real.
Aww.
You also don't really follow the news, but I digress. I think the sort of reporting we usually see, particularly in the West, is the sort of good guys versus bad guys, rebels versus the officials, terrorists versus the government kind of reporting.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
Yeah, war in history is always complex, but I think it's important to at least get an overview because it's the reason that Priya and Nades both fled Sri Lanka.
Okay, so who was the war between?
It's broadly between the Sri Lankan government and an organization known as the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ulam, also known as the LTTE or the Tamil Tigers.
Ah, that's the group Nades was a part of. So how did this war start?
You are about to find out. Sri Lanka crash course, here we go.
Whoa!
So Sri Lanka is this island just southeast of India.
Yeah, I knew that bit. It's like roughly the size of Tasmania, right?
Yeah, but look, I don't want to assume anything with you, Jay.
Harsh, but fair.
It's made up of a few main ethnicities. The Sinhalese, who account for around 3/4 of the population, Ulam Tamils, who are just over 10% of the population, and Moors, who are just under 10% of the population. Priya and Nades, as well as myself, are Ulam Tamil, and the Sri Lankan government is pretty much run by the Sinhalese at the time of the war.
Okay, Priya and Nades are Tamil, the government run by the majority Sinhalese. So is it an ethnic war?
Yeah, partially.
What are they fighting over?
Be patient, Jay. There's a bit we need to establish first. So, the British colonized the island in 1815, but they can't run the country all by themselves. So, the British do something a bit sneaky and strategic.
It was conventional British colonial policy to look for minorities in colonised territories and to use them where possible as the administrative class.
This is Damien Kingsbury, Emeritus Professor of Deakin University.
Minorities would tend to be more amenable to being used in this fashion because they were minorities, and that, if you like, strengthened their position relative to ethnic majorities in those colonised areas.
When we say minorities, we are talking about Tamil people here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So giving Tamil people disproportionate power over the majority Sinhalese population would feel like favoritism. I don't imagine the Sinhalese took it very well.
Yeah, look, when the British hand back independence to the island in 1948, the Sinhalese are looking to shift the balance. They take power back by pure numbers.
If they were to vote as an ethnic bloc, they would by definition have a majority vote.
And you have this sort of Sinhalese nationalism that's starting to come out.
The Sinhalese in Sri Lanka have fused their understanding of being Sinhalese with their religious belief, Theravada Buddhism, and their conception of nationalism. And they've regarded the Tamils, by way of contrast, and Muslims as being, if you like, interlopers, as being at best visitors in their land, not being genuine citizens in the sense that they constructed nationalism around a Sinhalese Buddhist identity. By definition, that excluded minorities.
And so the Sinhalese start to enact all these things to disenfranchise everyone else. Here's Umesh Perimbanayagam, who was a researcher at the University of Auckland on
how to characterize the crimes committed against the Tamils in Sri Lanka. One of the first acts that was implemented by the new government was to disenfranchise about 800,000 of those million workers.
Are these workers Tamil?
Indian Tamil laborers brought to Sri Lanka by the British. So sort of yes, but sort of no. And now that the Sinhalese are in power, they're basically overcorrecting for the last 400 years of colonization.
So then in 1956, they passed the so-called Sinhala Only Act.
I'm guessing that makes Sinhalese the official language.
At the exclusion of Tamil.
That automatically excluded a lot of ethnic Tamils from government positions, which they had previously occupied, and also from educational opportunities, which were regarded as very important by most Tamils.
And 2 years later, there are riots because of this. Now, the impact of the Sinhala Only Act changes over time.
But it was indicative of the view held by many Sinhalese that Tamils were really only guests in what should have been a Sinhalese country that was preserved, moreover, for Theravada Buddhism.
Tamils take to the streets and peacefully protest with very little luck.
So I'm guessing it escalates?
Yeah, you have the burning of the Jaffna Library, one of the biggest libraries in Asia. Not only is this done by a pro-Sinhalese mob, but also in the presence of 2 Sinhalese cabinet members. And of course, this library is in the north, which is a Tamil area. Naturally, things continue to escalate until
eventually it devolved to a point where many Tamils asked for independence or demanded independence, and that then spilled over into conflict and eventually into civil war.
Now, a number of Tamil political organizations had formed in the 60s and 70s before the Civil War. But once the war starts, one group takes over, the LTTE.
It's conventional, if you like, in these sorts of situations for there to be unity, for there to be one voice representing a people.
But what actually starts the war?
Well, on the 23rd of July, 1983, the LTTE launches an attack on the Sri Lankan army, killing 13 people. A massive riot breaks out in response.
The Sinhalese are rioting, I'm guessing?
Not just that, but government ministers are seen directing people to attack Tamil civilians and their properties, including people who had nothing to do with the Tigers. The riots destroy shops and homes. Families are burned alive. Within the week of riots, 150,000 Tamils are displaced. At least 500 Tamil women were raped, and at least 3,000 Tamil lives were lost. But interestingly, the Sri Lankan government put the death toll at around 300. 5 days after the start of the riots, President Jayawardena, who is Sinhalese, makes his address to the nation. He says the time had come to appease the natural desires and requests of the Sinhalese people to prevent the country from being divided.
So basically siding with the violent mob and offering no sympathy for the huge number of Tamils displaced.
Now, this period is what is often referred to as Black July.
So you have this ongoing discrimination against the non-Sinhalese people that's embedded and institutionalized. And it just gets worse and worse until Black July in 1983. And now there's a civil war. You have the Tamil Tigers fighting for their own land and statehood, and so they can self-govern. And you have the Sri Lankan government trying to take control of the whole island nation.
Yeah, and this is where you see the first wave of Tamil migration to Australia. This group consisted of Tamils who would meet the criteria for skilled migration, and a small number of Tamils who were accepted on humanitarian grounds. And it's within this context of war where Nades and Priya are growing up.
We were 7 kids. I was the youngest child. Growing up, I was doted on.
Doted?
So the word that Nades actually says is chellam. So chellam is one of those Tamil words that are difficult to translate into English. It's almost like the favorite child. I compare it to the story of Joseph and his brothers in the Bible.
Like Technicolor Dreamcoat Joseph?
I mean, like, only you would understand this reference of Andrew Lloyd Webber Joseph as opposed to the Bible Joseph.
Yes. So, are you a chellam?
Obviously, I am my Appa's chellam.
That's so cute. Can I be a chellam too?
Yes, you can.
Actually, I don't think I am. I don't think there's a favorite in my family.
Yes, there is, and it's your brother.
Probably true.
The thing is, you can tell that Nades was the chellam of the family. He's so softly spoken and is like a, can I make you tea? No problems, of course kind of guy.
So, as Nades is growing up, what is the war like for him?
I still remember they had rounded up this guy in my village, beat him in front of me, put a tire around him, poured gasoline on him, and burned him alive.
And the people doing this, that's the Sri Lankan armed forces and their associates?
Correct. Now, Nades was living with his family in an LTTE-controlled area where the Tigers effectively ran a de facto state. They provided public services like police, courts, and schools.
So instead of complaining to your local government about like those potholes in the road, you'd be going to the Tamil Tigers for assistance?
I mean, I know people are worried about potholes to that extent, but to answer your question, a bit of yes and a bit of no.
So where do the Tamil Tigers get their money from?
From a shit ton of different sources. Funds from the diaspora, real estate, business, and collecting money from locals. Kind of like a tax.
We had been giving money regularly to the Tamil Tigers. A family member had to join the Tigers, or you had to give them money. That's how we lived. I think we had been giving money for about 5 or 6 years. I was young, so I don't fully remember. But at some point, we stopped giving money. Remember, though, there were 7 kids in the family. So when we went to the temple, I was taken by the Tigers. They said, you have to join the movement. You can't go home. You must join.
So instead of a monetary payment, Nadez's family paid with a human?
Yeah, with their chellam.
Look, I think I do know better, but this kind of sounds like forced labor or indoctrination.
Look, I think that's very easy for us to say in our safe, cushy Australian homes where we're not hiding from bombs every other day. But in times of war, conscription isn't really that uncommon. Here's Damien Kingsbury again.
Young Tamil men in particular were required to perform military service, and families often would accept that their young men would have to join the LTTE for a period of time and serve with it in order for them to be able to just get along with life.
But this isn't like the government conscripting people. It's a military group forcing people to join them.
Well, what's the difference between the Tigers conscripting people versus the Sri Lankan government? I think this comes back to this whole rhetoric around the LTTE being painted as terrorists.
I don't think the word terrorism is very helpful in trying to understand political organisations. It means, in most contexts, to compel people to a course of action through the use of violence. Interestingly, that is also the definition of war as outlined by Karl von Clausewitz, the great theoretician of war. So in one sense, there's no difference. The difference is, I think, that where the people engaged in the violent activity are non-state actors, the states claim legitimacy and they say, by consequence, if they are legitimate and anybody opposing them who is a non-state actor is illegitimate, if they're illegitimate, then they use labels like terrorism and so on.
So we see the Sri Lankan army as legit because they're like officially state sanctioned. But if it weren't for that, they're not really more legitimate or right than the LTTE?
Right, and the LTTE are kind of functioning as a government in the north and the east anyways. So asking people to help fight for their land isn't always seen as a horrendous or inhumane act. I think Nades puts it quite well.
I had already seen some horrific things in Sri Lanka, so this didn't seem like a big deal. They were only fighting for our land in our struggle, so okay. I wasn't scared. I didn't try to escape from the Tigers. It was okay. I wasn't actively looking to join, but here it was, right in front of me. It's like I quickly realized I had a chance to be a part of the Tigers and this needed to be done, and I accepted.
Now, he's in the Tigers for around 11 years, and
there are many things that I can't discuss or disclose openly for my own safety.
But Nades does talk about doing things like preparing food and organizing the basic needs for LTGE soldiers. A few years into being a Tamil tiger, and he's yet to see his family. The thing is, this is the early 90s where mobile phones aren't really a thing yet. So he does this really challam thing where he plays a prank on his mum.
My mom had missed the bus and I saw her walking. She didn't realize who I was. I asked her, "Where are you going?" She said that I have a son that I'm going to see.
How cheeky of Nades.
Nades directs his mum to a nearby house saying, "This is where your son will be," and leaves her there. But someone ruins it and accidentally reveals who he is to his mum.
Someone told her, "The guy that just dropped you here is your son." As soon as I came back, she hugged me and said, "You couldn't even take the time to tell me it was you, my son. I haven't seen you in so long, so I came to find you, and you couldn't even tell me that it was you, you rascal."
I love that even during like a literal war, Nades is still trying to find ways to play little practical jokes.
Right? It's so cute.
So chalam.
So chalam. But for Nades, the war is becoming too much. It's been going on his whole life. It's completely broken up his family. And for what?
There was a rift between the Matakalapu and Yalpanam leaderships of the Tigers. They had different objectives. It wasn't even worth talking about trying to fix it. At one point, we were all together hoping to win, but that wasn't going to happen anymore.
He couldn't see how it was going to lead to peace. He reaches a breaking point where
I didn't feel like I could fix any of the problems, so I felt like the only choice was to leave to another country.
So Nades attempts to leave Sri Lanka for Qatar.
When you join the Tamil Tigers, you're given a new name by them.
He leaves using his birth name and goes to Qatar, then Kuwait, and then back to Qatar for work. Each time, though, he has to come back through Sri Lanka first.
How is he getting in and out of the country so freely?
He says it's all through an agency.
It was a Muslim guy who would give money to people in the airport who would end up providing clearance to people who were traveling.
Ah, so essentially paying people off so he can get on a plane.
More or less.
Wait, is this what Peter Dutton was talking about when he said Nades had travelled in and out of the country?
You mean when he made the false claim? Nades left a country multiple times. It's just that country was Sri Lanka and not Australia. Now, the second time he comes back to Sri Lanka,
I had been arrested in Matakalapu,
which is a major city on the eastern coast of Sri Lanka. His name is blacklisted there, which means it's really hard to find work or shelter. Like, life is difficult enough under war conditions, but it's even harder now. Then the third time he comes back and he's arrested again.
They said I wasn't allowed to leave the country, that they had my fingerprints and had provided these to the airport. If I tried to leave, the airport would identify me. They said, "If we catch you alive at the airport, your family won't even know where to find your dead body."
I'm guessing that's why he decides to come to Australia on a boat?
Well, yes, but before we get to that, let's catch up on Priya's life.
Of course. Okay, Priya.
So for the first part of Priya's life, it's actually pretty good.
Until I was 14, I was the only girl. I was born in 76. My younger sister was born in 90, so I was an only child for a long time. I grew up in a loving family and we lived a very happy life.
And then, let me guess, the war happened.
You know it. And like Nades and all the other Tamils in the region, Priya's also seen some horrific things happen at the hands of the Sri Lankan government.
At that time, people who did the wrong thing would have their throats sliced and they'd be hung. This was around 86, 87, 88. My older brother and I were little kids. One day when we were coming home from school, we saw some people who had two guys with them covered in a sarong. These people had a knife, and with the flick of a button, the blade flung open and sliced one of the guys' throats. We screamed and ran home. Hearing our screams, my mum met us halfway. We couldn't go to school for a week after.
The Sri Lankan armed forces are executing people on the streets in front of children.
Well, Priya and her family are living in the midst of a war, so this kind of violence would not be unusual.
Our house was only 1 kilometre from an army camp. There were frequent shootings. Someone was found shot in a well near us. I had gotten injured. My dad had also gotten injured in his eye and had problems with one side of his body. When a bomb went off, my father, little brother and I were all injured. We had surgery in Colombo. I had pieces of shrapnel in my hip that were removed before we went to India. We could not live like this. The army frequently searched for my dad. They also kept my mum and dad in a camp. They always came to our house just searching.
Then someone who was on the cards for an arranged marriage to Priya is burned alive.
There were 4 others who were captured with him. They put shopping bags over their heads, a tie around them, and burned them alive. The smell of burning human flesh lingered for a really long time.
He doesn't survive, and because Priya is associated with him, people start gossiping about why this happened to Priya and her family. What is it about Priya that brought this on him?
Like, because he's killed, by association, she's cursed?
Right. And things get that bad that Priya's family decides to flee to India.
We left everything behind. My mum's youngest sister and her were inseparable. We all had gotten in the car, and as we drove away, she ran after the car as far as my eyes could see. Even today, I cannot forget this memory.
Priya never saw this auntie again. Now, things in India aren't necessarily better. Priya's family are living in a refugee camp, and whilst they're not in the middle of a war zone, they're not safe yet.
We were there as asylum seekers, so we didn't have any rights. We needed to register our details with the local police, the Q branch. We also needed to report to them where we lived on a monthly basis. They would harass and question us about who was visiting us. They would repeatedly say that they are going to send us back to Sri Lanka. So we understood that even in India, we aren't safe. So my younger brother and I made a decision to find safety.
Now, while all of this is going on, you have Australia.
What are we doing?
So I think for Australia, at least, having Sri Lanka as a key neighbour within the Indian Ocean region, which Australia is also a part of, was crucial, both militarily, for economic reasons and political reasons as well.
That's Dr. Niro Kandasamy.
I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Sydney.
But wait, why is Sri Lanka a key neighbour, and why is it important in the Indian Ocean?
Well, if you look at Australia on a map, Sri Lanka is one of our closer neighbors in the Indian Ocean, and it's kind of an access point into the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Asia.
Sri Lanka has always been highly strategic for a lot of Western nations because of where it's located. There are really significant ports in Sri Lanka. During World War II, ports in Sri Lanka were used by the British, and that kind of thinking has continued even after World War II.
All of this talk of ports, what is the significance of ports?
In the current context, you can say that the major trading routes for China all go past the island.
That's researcher Umesh again.
Trincomalee Harbour, which is in the traditional Tamil-speaking area, is one of the best ports in the Indian Ocean region, one of the best deep-sea ports, which historically colonial powers have recognised its importance.
What makes it such a good port?
It's deep, it's sheltered, it's large. And there aren't many other places in the Indian Ocean region like that.
This one harbour was sought after by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the French, and then the British, all within a few hundred years. Even after the British handed over independence to the island, they held on to Trincomalee for another 9 years because of its strategic position. The US even used it as an airbase in World War II.
Okay, got it. It's a very good port.
I think the fact that we now know the significance of the ports in Sri Lanka makes it important for Australia to, on behalf of the West, maintain useful relations with Sri Lanka.
Okay, so hold that thought. We'll come back to ports and Trinco in a bit. Now, partway through the war, in 2002, peace negotiations started happening between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE.
But there was a formal ceasefire agreement signed in February 2002. And then there was 6 rounds of peace talks in various places around the world.
It was quite a group effort with various countries involved in different parts of the talks, all trying to put forward their own version of peace. Importantly, the Tamil Tigers wanted a separate country, but reluctantly agreed to explore a separate state under a unified Sri Lanka. The US, though, make it very clear that there would be no self-governing of the North and the East. The Sri Lankan government had to have control over the entire island.
The US are throwing their weight around a bit, hey. But it's good that they're even talking about what peace could look like.
Once a ceasefire agreement was entered into, checkpoints were lifted, and all the roads were opened up reconnecting Jaffna and the Vanni to the rest of the country. People who were internally displaced started to return home, curfews were lifted, and people weren't in this constant fear of shelling. My family and I actually went back to Sri Lanka around this time.
Oh, really? What was it like?
I mean, going to the north was like crossing a border, but we didn't have any issues at the time. It was all fine. I think the most notable thing I remember was my parents and I going to what was like a customs interview where they asked us questions about what we were doing overseas, what I was studying, and how I would contribute to Tamil Ulam in the future. My parents then paid a donation of some sort, and that was that.
In this period, there was actually a decrease in the number of refugees leaving the island, and some refugees were coming back to the island. I've met some refugees in Australia who, during that period, went back to the island from India.
Wait, so the ceasefire and the hope of peace actually meant less people were fleeing Sri Lanka as refugees? And so if peace talks succeeded, it would have solved one of Australia's current problems of Tamil refugees fleeing to Australia?
It would, yes, but it would also mean no access to Trincomalee for the US and Australia.
Right, so we're back to ports. So Trinco is that important?
For show. Now keep in mind, this is all happening post 9/11. Terrorism has taken on a whole new meaning. The US, along with the help of Australia, has invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and during this whole process, they realized they could really use a good port like Trinco.
What do they want it for?
Well, according to diplomatic cables on WikiLeaks, the US wanted to use Sri Lanka as a strategic location in its focus on Asia. The problem is, Trinco was surrounded by the tigers.
So, in order to access it, they need the Sri Lankan government to defeat the Tamil tigers.
That's right.
Because, so one of the features of the LTT is that they had a naval force. So their existence essentially precluded the US.
So what did the US do?
So at a high level, the US takes a two-pronged approach. Firstly,
so the US had prescribed the LTT as a terrorist organization 97 under this legislation, the Foreign Terrorist Organization.
This is of course before 9/11, but there's a key meeting that's held in the US in 2003. This one specifically about joint aid between the Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. Now, because the Tamil Tigers are a terrorist organization in the US, their reps aren't able to obtain visas, so they can't attend this key meeting.
I mean, it's a bit hard to discuss joint aid when one of the two parties involved isn't there.
Exactly. It completely undermines the concept that both parties are equal in the peace process.
Major countries in the EU were willing to support a joint approach to delivering aid, but the US didn't want that to happen.
The US continuously worked to destabilize the balance by not only favoring the Sri Lankan government, but also...
And so then the US started lobbying the EU to ban the LTT, which it eventually succeeded to do in May 2006.
Even when the facilitators of the peace negotiation advised against this. This put the nail in the coffin in terms of both parties having the same ability to negotiate.
And 2 months later, the government of Sri Lanka launched its full-scale war.
But while this is all going on, in the background, the US is also
training Sri Lankan special forces on the island.
Ah, the second prong.
Now, outwardly, the US expressly state that they support the peace negotiations. But behind the scenes, the US is training the Sri Lankan government's military and is donating equipment to them. They recommend the Sri Lankan government secure Trinco to give them an upper hand in the war.
And once peace negotiations fall through, the Sri Lankan army take Trinco?
Just like the US recommended.
And what about Australia in all of this?
Yeah, so essentially Australia took the same line as the US during this period.
So for example, in 2001, Australia bans the Tigers as a terrorist organization. Even back in 1996, the Australian government refused to meet with Tamil groups unless they disavowed the Tigers. Plus,
there was an organization called the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization.
The TRO were willing to deliver aid to the north and the east, even where there were landmines. And they lobbied the Australian government to channel aid money through them, rather than through the Sri Lankan government.
And Australia refused to give money to that, which was the same position of the US. But if you look at EU countries, many EU countries gave money to the TRO. New Zealand gave money to the TRO.
UNICEF even donates the equivalent of almost 1.5 million Aussie dollars to the TRO. Other governments, including Norway, agreed to fund them directly. But Australia identifies the TRO as funding the Tigers, which prevents fundraising. The US goes so far as to freeze the TRO's assets because it considers the TRO a support network of the Tigers.
There was a difference in policy between Western states, and Australia was aligned with the US basically during the peace process.
Even one of our diplomats, who was posted in Sri Lanka, said that as a result of US pressure, Australia banned fundraising for the Tigers, harassing local members of the Tamil community in the process. The Australian Federal Police raided the homes of people alleged to be fundraising for the Tigers. In May 2007, they arrested Tamils living in Australia with terrorism charges. That same year, a bilateral trade agreement was concluded between Australia and Sri Lanka, worth $232 million per year.
So very one-sided, really. It's just this demonization of the Tamil Tigers and anyone who could be associated with them.
The war in Sri Lanka continues. The US continues to train Sri Lankan troops in order to take down the Tigers, and the Sri Lankan armed forces continue to take over more and more of the Tiger-controlled areas. This escalates all the way up until late 2008. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are trapped on a tiny strip of land called Mullivaikkal.
If you look it up on Google Maps like I did, it's about 1 kilometer in width, surrounded by a lagoon to the west and the open ocean to the east. So what happens at Mullivaikkal?
Both sides, the Tigers and the Sri Lankan armed forces, commit horrific war crimes. With respect to the Tigers, as Professor Kingsbury puts it,
it did kill some civilians, there's no doubt about that, but it did see that as part of its broader goal or its broader purpose of trying to create an independent Tamil state. And by the same token, the Sri Lankan government used indiscriminate violence on a number of occasions, killed many civilians, particularly at the end of the war. In the last few months, some 40,000 civilians were killed by the Sri Lankan government.
At least 40,000, if not more than 150,000, as reported by the International Truth and Justice Project.
That 150,000 Tamil civilians are being corralled in a corner the size of Central Park in Manhattan and being shelled by Sri Lankan troops,
including hospitals and a UN hub. The Sri Lankan government says it's only 9,000 civilian deaths.
My government's precise and well-coordinated humanitarian operation has succeeded in rescuing almost all civilians who were being used as human shields by the LTT.
The civil war ends on the 18th of May 2009, when the leader of the LTTE, Vallupala Prabhaharan, is killed.
I'm proud to announce that my government has, in an unprecedented humanitarian operation, finally defeated the LTT militarily.
For Tamil people, this day is marked as Mullivaikkal Remembrance Day, to commemorate the thousands of lives lost at the hands of the Sri Lankan government. But for the rest of Sri Lanka, this is something that's celebrated. Many people took to the streets to mark the end of a decades-long war.
In the capital Colombo, celebrations erupted on the streets as the government made its announcement that the Tigers had been defeated.
And how was the rest of the world reacting?
There were protests all over the world.
I have been in politics for 22 years. I have never seen a demonstration of this size in London.
In Australia, leading up to Mullivaikkal, a rally took place in front of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's residence in Sydney, urging our government to join the call for an immediate ceasefire. We even had 5 protesters commence a hunger strike, supported by 1,000 others.
Whoa, okay, so just to sum up, there could have actually been peace between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. And this peace would have meant no Mullivaikkal, no slaughtering of 100,000 people, and no further war for another 3 years. Plus, it would have meant the Tamil people in Sri Lanka have a land they can call their own, which they could self-govern. And it would essentially stop Tamil people fleeing by boat to Australia as asylum seekers.
None of them would have come because basically the large outflow of asylum seekers to Australia, the ones that arrived by sea, all started after 2009 or in the lead up to the final massacre.
Like, isn't that what we want?
Some would say yes, But like the US, Australia's idea of peace likely would have not included any type of separate Tamil state. And there's a lot we don't know. But what we do know is Australia had a huge problem with anything supporting the Tigers. We also know Australia has strong ties with the US that goes back decades. And we saw how pressure from the US impacted Tamils living in Australia. Plus, we also helped the US with their war on terror in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And this war on terror highlights how Sri Lanka and Trinco could be strategically important to the US.
So now with Australian troops in Afghanistan, it wouldn't really make much sense for Australia to go against US interest. I just can't see a world where Australia genuinely supports a separate Tamil state.
That would be my take as well, and Umesh's.
The Australian position aligned with what the US was doing. So in this regard, Australia should be held responsible for creating this refugee situation.
So now, Australia is faced with the forced migration of Tamil asylum seekers arriving by boat to our shores, which our government does not want, which then causes Australia to further rely on the Sri Lankan government to try and stop Tamils fleeing to Australia.
So it's the height of hypocrisy to destroy the peace that Tamils had so much hope in. And then after 2009, start doing everything they can to stop those people fleeing from a situation which they had an important part in creating.
That is wild.
Right? Now, many also consider what the Sri Lankan government did a genocide.
What exactly is a genocide?
It's a term that only came about to describe the Nazi policies in the Holocaust. As Professor Kingsbury puts it,
it does have a particular meaning in international law, which is the destruction or attempted destruction of a people or a culture in whole or in part. So by that definition, what happened to the Tamil people over a period of time could be considered genocide.
But wait a minute. Getting back to Nades and Priya, the civil war ends in May 2009. Nades and Priya don't flee until 2012 and 2013. Are things not more stable after the war ends?
Well, think about it. You have these parts of Sri Lanka that are predominantly Tamil and were previously controlled by the Tigers. There are still a lot of people who probably support what the Tigers are fighting for, so the Sri Lankan government can't just let everybody go about their business.
Thousands and thousands of people were jailed, held in very poor conditions. Many people were murdered. There were disappearances, widespread disappearances, and a culture of disappearance. And that really did characterise the first couple of years after the war.
Okay, that definitely doesn't sound great. But I mean, things have to be a bit better now that the war's over, right?
Well, it depends on what you consider better. Sure, there aren't shells going off around you all the time, but now the Tamil areas in the north and the east are so heavily militarized. It's like the army moved in to secure an area during the war, and then they just never left.
It is in effect an occupied country in its own right, and the Tamil people do feel that they are being militarily occupied. Many of them have been moved or pushed out of their homes. Their lands have been occupied forcibly. They feel discriminated against. The military acts as a de facto government in Tamil areas. Yet the communication between Tamils and the military, because the military is overwhelmingly Sinhalese, is very difficult. So even though the war has finished, it's still like there's an army of occupation in the north of the country.
Which is a very different picture to the image Sri Lanka is putting out into the world.
Where multi-ethnic, multicultural and multi-religious communities live in plural harmony, as they have done from time immemorial.
So, it's within this context that Nades and Priya decide to flee the country.
Right, so when we last left Nades, his passport had been seized and he'd been told that if he tried to leave the country, he would be killed.
You will not be alive. I didn't have any plans to come to Australia, but the opportunity came quickly to travel by sea as I couldn't go through an airport.
In 2012, Nades is put in touch with someone who said that they can get him on a boat and out of the country.
I had paid 3.2 million Sri Lankan rupees.
Which is around 22,000 Aussie dollars back then, or $26,000 today, adjusted for inflation.
They didn't tell us anything. They said, there is a boat going to Australia. Do you want to go? That's all they asked. We said, okay. We were in a country that didn't value our life. Australia wasn't like that. If I went, I could settle there and live my life safely. Rather than losing my life in Sri Lanka, I was hoping to save my life by getting on this boat. I was used to boats, so it wasn't a big deal for me. But a lot of other people were throwing up and had gotten sick. But I wasn't afraid of the ocean. I thought, I am on a boat, but at least I'm alive. The Sri Lankan Navy are the ones who helped us get on the boat.
Wait, the Sri Lankan Navy? Like official government people?
I can confirm you heard that correctly.
The government are the ones who help Tamil people to leave on these boats because they don't want us in the country. They had a list of names and I would have been arrested if they could identify me. But it was nighttime and they couldn't identify any of us.
But I thought the Sri Lankan government were cooperating with Australia to stop asylum seekers coming on boats.
Yeah, I originally thought that too, and we'll touch more on this later. But Nades even says the Sri Lankan Navy escorted his boat to international waters.
After they boarded everyone, we traveled quite a distance, maybe about 6 or 7 hours. At that point, the Navy said, okay, you can continue on your journey. We will leave you here. We only came this far to make sure you get to this point. After this, we parted ways, and we continued on our journey.
Now, for Priya, she's been living in a refugee camp in India when her family tells her she should get on a boat.
So Priya just said, okay?
Yep. In Tamil culture, there is a strong sense of familial duty and honoring your parents. So the cultural norms would include not going against your family's wishes. At that time anyways. I wouldn't.
They asked me to go, so I went.
Priya was loaded onto a smaller boat that would take them to a larger boat. Her younger brother was meant to go with her, but...
So once they had boarded us ladies onto the small boat, there was some issue when the Navy arrived. This meant the men couldn't board. We were boarded in secret. Women were boarded onto the boat in a different area from the men.
So Priya's brother was meant to be on another boat?
Right, but her brother never made it onto the boat. Only Priya did.
When I got on the boat, I only had clothes and a bed sheets. No food.
Priya is thrown on this boat.
Thrown?
Yeah, that's how she describes it, and she says it's like hell.
People were throwing up on top of each other. We couldn't blame anyone, that's just how it was. I started throwing up blood and was seriously unwell. Someone brought what I thought was water to me, so I drank it. And someone told me that I had drunk out of a vessel that someone had vomited into. Then I looked at it, and sure enough, there was vomit dripping off it. I will never forget this. It wasn't easy to come on these boats.
Now, there were 97 people on Priya's boat, mostly women. Priya says there was water and food.
What sort of food?
Like congee?
Ah, like a rice porridge.
Yep, but they only had enough for 4 to 5 days. Nothing after that.
Not even water?
No water.
The salt in the winds and the extreme heat would make our mouths dry up.
They would collect rain on the tarps that were hung up, but sometimes the rainwater would be dirty.
There was no other choice, so we had to drink that water.
Priya's boat was also falling apart. The rudder breaks 8 days in, and they had to tie a rope to the rudder to operate it.
So on one side you pull the rope, the other side you turn the rope, another side you need to loosen it. It went on like this for 8 days. If the boat was in good condition, the rudder would not have broken.
So what about Nades?
Also a very similar experience. He had food for a couple of days.
They boiled us the leftover pumpkin. I threw up eating it. I only drank water after that. I thought, okay, we will all die here on the ocean. Let's see what happens. Let's see whether I end up dead in the ocean or alive in Australia. The people on board were all about to faint. They had been throwing up repeatedly and no one could speak. They were all very sick. No one expected that we would arrive alive. I can recall people saying out loud that they wouldn't have gotten on this boat if it was going to be like this. We were on a small boat with 99 people, and to sleep, we would lean on each other. If we needed to go to the toilet, we would have to step on people. It was a difficult journey. No one should have to experience this.
After 17 days for Nades and 14 days for Priya, Nades finally nears Christmas Island, and Priya arrives at Cocos Islands.
Both external territories of Australia.
They are two of 578 boats that arrived on our shores between 2012 and 2013.
That is when I thought we will reach the shore, and I had faith once again that my life will be saved.
Little did they know that they were arriving in a country that has some of the toughest asylum seeker policies. A country that has kept people in detention for over 10 years. A country that will do almost anything to stop refugees from coming and staying.
Yet it's also the country where they met and married and started a family, and where they established a life and community in Biloela. And it's from this community that they were ripped away from on the 5th of March 2018. A community that would not stop until the family were back home safely in Biloela.
So, how did they do it? That's next on
You Have Been Told a Lie. A lie. You have been told a lie.
Thoughts on today's episode? Let us know over at You've Been Told a Lie on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Because Twitter has a character limit for its handles, find us on Been Told a Lie on Twitter.
If you want to learn more about the history of Sri Lanka leading up to the Civil War, the geopolitical factors of the negotiations, and life in Sri Lanka post-2009, you can find links to those at our website at youhavebeentoldallie.com, where you can also find all of our references and the transcript for this episode.
We note that asylum seekers experience a lot of trauma, not only before arriving at our borders, but also living in detention. This has an impact on recollection and details.
Due to the nature of Priya and Nades' journey across borders, there are some aspects of this story that we will only ever know from their perspective. We've reached out to relevant parties where possible, and where comments were provided, a summary has been included.
This episode is written by Jay Uy and produced by Jay Uy and Tanesh Vilanaraja. Me.
Audio editing by myself.
Tamil translations by me and Neeraja Samhuanaban.
Priya's English translation is voiced by Emma Harvey, and Nadez's English translation is voiced by Matthew Predney, who also composed the music you're listening to right now.
The consulting producer is Rebecca Holt.
Special thanks to Priya, Nades, Kopika, Tharanika, the Home to Billo team, and the interviewees in this episode, Umesh Perin-Panayagam, Damien Kingsbury, and Nero Kandasamy.
Thanks to Miles Martignoni, Jess Bennett, Cassandra Steeth, Scott Spark for script and story advice, and MacArthur Amy for helping with the research and fact-checking.
This series is possible thanks to the Jesse Cox Audio Fellowship. Thank you Kyu-Min Liu, Benjamin Law, Scott Spark, Jess Bennett, Carly Reid, Claire Holland, and the rest of the team.
There have been many people we've spoken to who have helped in so many ways, and many who have asked to remain anonymous. We see you, and we thank you for your support.
This podcast was written, edited, and produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge all elders past, present, and emerging.
We also pay our respects to the traditional custodians of Gungaloo country where Biloela is now situated. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land.
A lie.
In the next episode, the family are held in Melbourne detention, where they're told that they can't even make a phone call until they agree to leave the country.
3 days passed. In my mind, I thought, this is not going to work. I had decided, let's sign the papers, get the number, and contact a lawyer, because if we didn't sign it, we wouldn't be able to call anyone, nor would we be able to do anything if they tried to deport us.
And the Biloela community are left shocked by the sudden disappearance of the family.
You know, we'd been trying for 2 years to explain to the government why this family needed to stay, and it made perfect sense to everybody.